Hello, everyone. My name is Connie Silva. I'm the director of the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. And what you're about to watch is a recording on target population for compliance and improvement monitoring for comprehensive coordinated early intervening services, or CIM for CSACE. And this recording is brought to you by the California Department of Education. We are going to go ahead and move forward. The topic of this, as I said, is target population. And the reason you're needing to get information on this is that the federal regulations of IDEA give you specific information on where you should be spending your CSACE funds. So you can see from this wording on the regulations, an LEA may use those funds reserved for comprehensive coordinated early intervening services to serve children from age 3 through grade 12, particularly but not exclusively children in those groups that were significantly over-identified under paragraph A or B of this section. And so what that means is that you are providing your services, your CSACE plan is actually going to be providing support to children who are not currently identified as needing special education or related services, but who need additional academic and behavioral support to succeed in the general education environment. And possibly also children with disabilities. And LEAs may not limit the provision of comprehensive coordinated early intervening services to only children with disabilities. So even though you're not at the point yet in your process of selecting which children you will be providing additional supports to under your CIM for CSACE, we do want to make sure that you're aware of what the regulations are and provide you some guidance on how to think about that, again, when you're ready for that point, but as you prepare and are looking at your data and your findings, you'll start to have thoughts about what you might possibly do with these funds. It's helpful to know in advance what's allowed and maybe more specifically, what's required. So I'm going to walk you through a tool and also a couple samples to help you get a better understanding of this. So let's start with the tool. SPP-TAP has created what we call our target population flowchart. It's available on the CIM for CSACE Padlet, and I'm going to walk you through. It's very brief, it's 2 pages. So I'm just going to show it to you, walk you through that resource so that you can use it in your own process when you're ready. And then, as I said, I'll show you a couple examples with this flowchart. So first, let's switch over to the resource. Okay, so what you're seeing, as I said, it's 2 pages. So this is, again, just a flow chart for the process that you would use. And you'll see it has your typical flow chart images, right? So what you do prior to this is you gather and analyze relevant qualitative and quantitative data to determine and prioritize your root causes. So that's the process you're currently going through as part of all of the activities that are in step 1. So the piece that I'm going to be describing doesn't actually happen until step 2. But again, this is what would happen after you've completed step 1 activities. You would identify your root causes. And so this flowchart basically helps you walk through after you've identified your root causes and determine which students you're going to serve. It gives you some tips and some questions to help you determine whether or not you've done a good job of selecting that target population. I'm going to show you page 2 of this document. So, because we're going to go through the flowchart with the examples, but page 2 actually provides you just some brief information, the definition of your identified group, which is the group of students that you are identified. So for instance, if you're over identification, you're significantly disproportionate for your African-American students identified as ED, then your identified group is just that, African-American students identified as emotionally disturbed. Or your target population is the group that you're selecting to serve in order to disrupt that over-identification. So it's more those students that you have determined are at risk of being over-identified as emotionally disturbed. And so that group is going to be predominantly, your target population, predominantly African-American students, because you're trying to, again, interrupt the over-identification. So in addition to those definitions, there's some notes on each of these action steps, sort of the points where you stop and ask a question to determine whether or not you have landed in the right place in terms of your target population. So again, just a little bit more narrative in describing those 6 steps. So back to this chart. we are going to walk through it with a couple samples, but just real quickly, after you've determined your criteria, you're going to go with your group, and you could use your CIM for CCEIS leadership team, or you could also use your educational partners team. Depends on the LEA, how you want to be doing this. You definitely want to be doing some of the preliminary work in terms of identifying your root causes, and then also selecting sort of the criteria for your target population with your educational partners. But then going through this process, you might use a smaller group. So some of the questions you would ask, we'll just go through this and I'll try to explain them. So after you have your root causes, you're actually going to, under number 1, determine the criteria based on those root causes of the students that you will be providing comprehensive coordinated early intervening services. And then you're going to ask yourself some questions. Are the selected students in your target population in need of additional supports? And the answer to that should be yes, right? Because again, you're trying to make sure that you are not just compliant with IDEA, but also selecting the students that you're most likely to end up then impacting or addressing your disproportionality, right? So the answer to that should be yes. If it's not, then you want to go back again to examine whether or not the criteria that you selected is appropriate and tied to your root causes. The next question would be, are most of the target population students from the identified racial or ethnic group? So in the example I gave prior, are most of them African American students? Again, the answer should be yes. And if it's no, you would once again move to the further up the chain and say, what did we do wrong, right? Let's take a look at this again. The fourth question is the target population only students with disabilities? If you remember, I said earlier, it cannot be only students with disabilities. The reason for that is the intent of these regulations and the CIM for CCEIS work that you'll be doing is to be preventative, right? To actually disrupt the over-identification prior to being identified. So if you're only supporting students with disabilities, that's not likely to happen. So you want to make sure that the answer to that question is no. And then the next box is the number of students reasonable? That's number 5. The reason for that is you're going to be providing services to these students and also tracking which students are provided services, not just to count the number of students that are provided services, but then also you'll be tracking them for 2 years following the receipt of the services. And so these are numbers that you're reporting to CDE at different times throughout your CCEIS period. And as I said, 2 years following the end of your CCEIS period. So you want to make sure that that number is reasonable, not just for tracking, but also for the provision of services. Do you in fact have enough funding to provide the services that you're hoping to provide to these students? And so that number being reasonable is really an LEA determination. There is no specific number or percent of students that you need to serve, other than that it needs to be a number greater than 0. So you could be providing CCEIS to a very small number of students. And then the last part is, if you can answer, the appropriate answer to each of those questions, then that's when you can proceed to develop your CCEIS activities that are for your identified target population. Okay. So I'm going to switch back to our PowerPoint. And I just, again, hopefully with some examples, this will become a little bit more real or relevant to you. I recognize just reading through them at this point is probably, you're probably not having enough information to make good sense of it. So hopefully with a couple samples, and these are samples that we've taken from LEA CCEIS plans. So hopefully that they feel real to you. So this first one, as I said, the first step is to gather and analyze relevant qualitative and quantitative data, right? Again, so they have determined and prioritized their root causes. And this just shows you some of the key points of their prior steps. So you have some information on the LEA, the total student enrollment, the percentage of students that are African American, and also the students that have disabilities within this district. And then some statistics on the African American students within that district. So you can see that African American students in this district are about 17% of the students, but they make up 23.5% of the students with disabilities. So that's a little high. They also make up 35%, over 35% of students that are specifically classified as OHI or other health impairment. So that is their area of disproportionality. They're significantly disproportionate for their African American students identified as OHI, and their risk ratio is 4.48, which means those students are about 4.5 times as likely as students of other race and ethnicities to be identified with other health impairment. You can also see from this that there are 28 schools and it's a K through 12 district. So the first question is, have you identified your root causes? And yes, they have. Here's where they landed. They feel their root causes are that they have a lack of defined and consistent multi-tiered system of support, processes, and procedures across schools. So they're a student study team. Those processes are lacking. And then they also have some deficient mindsets and beliefs that are present within the LEA. So after determining those root causes, they now want to take a look at the criteria based on the root causes to select the students that will receive CCEIS. So they've started with just describing some of the shared experiences or characteristics of their students that they feel are at risk for being identified with OHI. And so here you see some of what they've discovered. They know that their highest emotionally disturbed and OHI referrals happen in grades TK through grade 5. Their pattern of office referrals prior to referrals for special education. So they notice that they have a pattern of that. And I mentioned already, the African American students are 4.48 times more likely to be identified as OHI. And white students are also twice as likely to be identified as ED and OHI. So they're noticing, even though they're not currently identified for their white student population, they do have very high risk ratios for that group as well. So based on that, the LEA selected this following criteria. And I do want to point out that it is the LEA's decision as to what that criteria is. That's not something that anybody else determines for you. So it's your data that should lead you to this point. So where they landed is they want to support students in grades TK through 5, and in the students that fit all of these categories, and who have 3 or more discipline referrals within the first quarter of the 23-24 school year, and who are not students receiving special education. So let's take a look at what that would actually look like in the LEA. We have this little image to sort of diagram for you what those students are. So that big circle with the black border is the actual LEA, right? The students within that LEA. The first circle then is students that are only in general education, right? Because that was one of their criteria, students that are not currently identified as needing special education. Then in addition, they're looking at students in the grades TK through 5. So you want to find the overlap between those two. And their third criteria, or those students with more than 3 disciplinary referrals. So what that means is the group of students that they're actually going to support is the overlap of those 3 areas, or that triangle shaped group in the middle. That is their target population. Okay. So the question number 2 is, are these students the ones in need of additional support? So they're looking at this, the overlap of those 3 areas, that they can answer yes, these are the students that need additional support in order to be successful in the general education environment. The next question is about the identified racial or ethnic group. Are most of the students within that target population from the identified racial or ethnic group? And here's the breakdown by race and ethnicity. The target population, with, again, just an estimate using current data from their district, it would be 120 students that currently meet that criteria. 56% of those would be African American, 35% would be white, and 9% would be of other races and ethnicities. So they can answer yes to this question. The majority are African American. And you'll also notice that they also managed to, with that criteria, serve a high percentage of white students, which, as we mentioned earlier, are also disproportionate, although not yet at the level of being identified as significantly disproportionate. So they can answer yes to this question, and they move on to the next one, which is this exclusively students with disabilities, that target population? Again, because we want to focus on prevention, and their answer there is no, because they specifically limited to students within the general education environment? So the answer is no. They can move on to the next question. And that's number 5, which is reasonableness. Is the number of students reasonable? So again, this is an LEA determination. So for their student population of over 18,000, this group of 120 comes out to 0.6%. So less than 1% of their student population. They would determine, is that a number that they can track and monitor reasonably? And can they provide supports to that group number of students reasonably? So if they determine yes, that's fine. If they think that that group is too large, they could go back and include more criteria for the selection of those students. For instance, they could decide just to serve certain schools within that district. If they feel like it's too small, then they could change the criteria to include more students and they'd like to serve more students. For example, they could say, let's look at students with only 2 disciplinary referrals, right? And increase the number of students. So that is some of the leeway or the decision points that each LEA has. So in this one, they decided that this was reasonable. So this is where they landed for their defined target population. Students in grades TK through 5 who have 3 or more discipline referrals within a quarter. Again, they defined which quarter they were going to be looking at, and who are not students receiving special education. And using this current data, the group consists of approximately 120 students. All right, so then they landed at this place here where they were able to fill in the chart. It's just a simple chart to provide the breakdown of the students. And this is what they would be reporting to CDE. So this is the number of students that they would be providing CCEIS to with their 2023 CCEIS plan. It's just an estimate based on current data, and it's non-duplicated count. So in that first table, you would put in the estimated number of students currently not identified as needing special education that will receive CCEIS, and that was the 120 that they selected, because they did not identify any students currently identified as needing special education as part of their target population. The number in that second cell would be 0. There are no students currently with IEPs that are going to be receiving CCEIS within this LEA. So I'm going to give you one more sample. And again, everyone is different, so I want to give you at least a couple so you can see some of the differences. So again, we start with what has happened prior to our identification of our target population. They've gathered and analyzed their data and determined their root causes. So here's some of the what the information that we know from this LEA. Their total student enrollment, they have over 12,000 students. Their white population is 6.4%, and their African American population is 27%. Of students with disabilities, the white population is 8.7% of those students, and the African American students are 39% of those students. So both of those higher percentages in their students with disabilities than they are in the student enrollment as a whole, which is why their risk ratios are higher. And what they're identified for, they actually have 2 areas of identification. They are significantly disproportionate for their white population student that's been identified with emotional disturbance, or ED, and African American students, and this is for discipline. So 60% of discipline referrals and 60% of suspensions. So again, significantly disproportionate in those 2 different areas. So their root causes. So again, did they identify their root causes? And yes, they have identified them. They actually have a longer list than the last example, not unusual. So what they identified, and these are very briefly described, right? There's some cultural dissonance. There's an underutilization of Section 504. There's a lack of activities to promote parent involvement. There's a lack of activities to increase student engagement. There's a lack of comprehensive multi-tiered system of support. There's a lack of implementation of consistent discipline procedures and practices. And there's a turnover in certificated staffing and teacher absences from the classroom. So all of those things they feel are really contributing factors to their significant disproportionality. And I just want to point out that, again, they have more, but it might also be because they have 2 different areas of identification. So there's more areas that are probably impacting one or both of those areas. So when they then went on to determine the criteria based on the root causes to select the students, they put this list together of the shared experiences or characteristics of those students that they feel need additional supports. So mental health diagnoses was a common thing with early childhood trauma or some of biological origin. There were students that had spent time in foster care. Again, there's not necessarily everyone, but some things that were common in those characteristics. They were raised by someone other than their biological parents. That was frequent. Chronic absenteeism was an issue for many of them. They were struggling academically. There were also behavioral issues. And there was little to no school-based educational, behavioral, or mental health supports. And then no 504 plans were prior to referral for assessment. And then the last one is most were referred by parents or grandparents for assessment. Okay, so those are the characteristics and experiences that they found. And then bringing that down to the criteria that they're going to use to select the students that will be provided CCEIS. They landed on, they want to support students in the 6th through 12th grade who have greater than or equal to 10% absences in the previous school year, or any discipline referral or suspensions, or have parent or counselor referrals for mental health or social emotional supports. So you'll notice that in these criteria, these are or, not and. So you're going to have different groups of students and different ways in which they overlap in order to select which students actually fall into these categories to know who your target population is. So let's take a look at what that looks like again in a visual image. So the image with a big white circle with a black border is the LEA as a whole. Our first circle, again, they selected students in the 6th through 12th grade. So that's the blue circle there. And then they wanted to know about the students that have mental health referrals, right? And so that's a smaller group there with some overlap. And then they have those with the absenteeism, right? 10% or greater in the last year. And then those with the disciplinary referrals or suspensions. Again, those were the different criteria. And if you remember on this one, it's or, not and. So it's not the tiny triangle in the middle. It's actually those areas where those overlap with just the first group, which is the 6th through 12th grade population, right? So your target population here is obviously going to be 4 more students, but we'll see what those numbers actually look like. But so the first question was, are the selected students in the target population in need of additional supports? They've selected these criteria, so they do feel like those are the ones that need additional supports. Then you move on to the next question. Are most of the target population students from the identified racial or ethnic group? And in this one, then they break it down disaggregated. The target population consists of 600 students. Again, that's their estimate based on current data. 500 of those students in general education with white students, Latino students, and African American students. You can see the numbers there where how they break down. If you remember, they were out for their African American students and their white students. So it does look as though the majority of the students here fall into one of those 2 categories, right? Into those 2 categories. And then they also have students with IEPs, so students in special education, white, Latino, and African American, the way that they broke them down. And once again, the majority of those are either African American or white. So they can answer yes to that question, as they should. Then the next question, are these exclusively students with disabilities? The answer to that is no. You saw in the table before, there are some that are students with disabilities, but not all of them. So that's okay. And then the 5th question, reasonableness. So is the number of students reasonable? Well, again, when they broke it down, looking at their 12,486 students, their subgroup there came out to approximately 600. And that's 4.8% of their student group. So again, this is a question for the district. Do you have the resources to provide supports to these students, and then also to be able to track and monitor their progress during the provision of CCEIS and 2 years following that? And the 2 years following, I should have said this earlier, is you're actually tracking to see whether or not students without IEPs end up being students that later down the road are identified as a student in need of special education services. You're tracking that for 2 years and reporting that to the California Department of Education. Okay. So they provided that information, broke it down into the table that we showed you earlier. So in this LEA, there are 500 students who would be receiving services that are not currently identified as needing special education services. And then there are 100 who are currently identified as needing special education services. The actual numbers would change and they would report this on a quarterly basis and also annually to CDE. And finally, just a reminder on how to contact us should you need to reach out. You have my email address as well as that for Susan Stewart, my SPP-TAP colleague, and then the email address for CDE at intensivemonitoring@cde.ca.gov. Thank you.